Good evening, everyone. My name is Saskia Koenen-Snyder, and I'm a professor of modern Jewish history here at the University of South Carolina and the director of the Jewish Studies program. I'm delighted to see you all here tonight for an important and timely conversation regarding the intersection of free speech, academic freedom, and anti-Semitism on American college campuses, a topic that concerns us all deeply. So thank you all for being here tonight. After the October 7th attacks in Israel, I received a note from a Jewish studies instructor here on campus asking me if it was safe to teach the next day. Should I step into the humanities building classroom, she asked. In the days that followed, numerous Jewish students expressed similar worries, mainly about walking to classes by themselves. Some were politely but firmly asked in elevators and dorm hallways not to discuss the events in Israel, facing moments of sharp tension and discomfort in places and spaces shared with non-Jewish peers. Should we create a buddy system, one faculty member asked and proposed in a Zoom meeting, so Jewish students felt safe walking across campus? These were not sentences or questions that I had ever heard in my admittedly privileged experience at the University of South Carolina and in the United States. As a non-American teaching undergraduate courses on the modern Jewish experience and on the history of the Holocaust, this was language that I associated with 1930s Germany, not 2023 America. It underscored something I've always known, but never quite witnessed so upfront and personal. First, that anti-Semitism is always present underneath the surface, becoming visible and audible in times of crisis and distress. And second, the swiftness with which this occurs. My History of the Holocaust course explores, among others, the roots and manifestations of anti-Semitism in a quest to better understand the phenomenon. Whenever I ask my students early on in the semester to identify popular stereotypes about Jews, we ask, what types of prejudices come to mind when you hear the word Jewish or Jews? They never hesitate, and the answers are almost always the same. The alleged predisposition, being good with money, thirst for power and control, essentialist qualities of being cunning or untrustworthy, highly intellectual. Why do all these hands go up so quickly in the classroom? Because our students live in a culture where stereotypes about Jews persist. Even when our undergraduates recognize them as constructed, as false, and as dangerous, they are still exposed to their potency. The attacks in Israel and the war that followed, a new crisis, new distress, have sent shockwaves across the world. After initial sympathy and support, they propelled new levels of anti-Jewish sentiment, not merely here in the United States, but on different continents. Just last week, my own alma mater, the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, canceled a lecture series on anti-Semitism because university administrators feared violence. They canceled it the day before Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is typically held on January 27th, the day that commemorates the liberation of Auschwitz. A barrage of protests ensued on campus as well as in the media, to the point where there will now be an official debate in Parliament to discuss spiking anti-Semitism in the country. So America is certainly not unique in trying to wrestle with questions over anti-Semitism and free speech on university campuses. Tonight we'll hear from an authority on the subject. Dr. Jeffrey Herbst is a scholar of political science with a specialty in comparative politics, and for the past 5 years has served as president of the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Before his time at AJU, Dr. Herbst was president and CEO of the Newseum and the Newseum Institute in Washington, D.C., dedicated to increasing public understanding of the importance of free press and the First Amendment. The question of how core freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition apply to people's lives has deeply informed Dr. Herbst's work. But he's also known for his extensive research on political and international affairs in Africa. He is the author of State Politics in Zimbabwe, his first book, followed by States and Power in Africa, Comparative Lessons in Authority and Control, published by Princeton University Press in 2000, which received the Libert Best Book Award in Comparative Politics from the American Political Science Association. It was also a finalist for the Best Book in African Studies, awarded by the African Studies Association. More recently, he co-authored Making Africa Work, which the former Prime Minister of Kenya, Raila Odinga, insisted, quote, should be in the briefcase of every African leader as it answers the whys and the hows of Africa's development record. I think you've done pretty well as a scholar when not one but several prime ministers read your work and leave glowing blurbs on a book cover. I don't think anybody in this room has the same kind of compliments. From 2010 to 2015, Dr. Herbst was president of Colgate University, where he was instrumental in helping the university complete its nearly $500 million fundraising campaign, leading a university-wide strategic plan, and increasing the diversity and academic caliber of its educational programming. Over the past few months, Dr. Herbst has written thoughtful pieces, including a recent article in Inside Higher Ed about issues of anti-Semitism and free speech on American college campuses, especially when commitments to fight one and uphold the other collide. We need more debate, Dr. Herbst has argued, but we need to debate with nuance and with care and understand that upholding the right to free expressions comes with responsibilities and obligations, a duty that also pertains to university administrations. Dean Joel Samuels will join in this conversation. He's the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, who came to us from the law school, where he was professor of law and director of the Rule of Law Collaborative, overseeing programming focused on rule of law development across the globe, including Ukraine, West Africa, and Asia. As dean, he's taken the initiative to do what my own alma mater did not: discuss in an open forum difficult questions that affect our campus community. And I'm very grateful to him and to the College of Arts and Sciences to have taken this step. So we have two highly accomplished college administrators here tonight with backgrounds in comparative politics, law, and the humanities, who will help us better understand where free speech, academic freedom, and anti-Jewish sentiment intersect, and how to navigate these challenges in a manner deemed essential in the liberal arts tradition. I did want to tell you that there will be a time to ask questions after their conversation, but we've left note cards for you where you can write them down, and student ambassadors will collect them, and then there will be an opportunity to engage with those questions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Herbst and Dean Joel Samuels.
First of all, Jeff, thank you for being here with us tonight. This has been a long time in the making. It was October 15th that I first saw your writings post October 7th that really addressed in some of the most direct ways I had seen the intersection of academic freedom, free speech, and anti-Semitism, specifically on college campuses. And as Saskia just shared, and Saskia, thank you so much for that introduction. We called on Saskia because it seemed very awkward for me to introduce myself, but the college really thought it was important to host this event, and as the leader of the Jewish Studies program, you've really taken an extraordinary role in recent months on our campus, and we're grateful to you and all of your colleagues in the program. At that moment, it struck me that there's probably no one I can imagine who's more fitting to be part of a conversation like this than you. Leading American Jewish University, having led Colgate University, one of the premier liberal arts colleges in the country, but also having led the Newseum, which is committed to free speech and freedom of the press. And so we're gonna go pretty deep in the conversation, but I wanted to start just by setting a table for everyone. If you could just talk a little bit about the distinction between free speech on the one hand and academic freedom on the other.
Sure, Joel. And let me say first, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. As some of you heard before, Joel was actually my student when we were both at Princeton, and I think the professors will agree that really there's nothing more gratifying in this career than to see your students go on to great things. And so I'm really delighted to be here and really delighted to be with you and your colleagues. And I'd also like to compliment you for having this talk. While there's been a lot of discussion about free speech, anti-Semitism, especially since October 7th, many universities, as part of the self-censorship that we've seen across the academy, have shied away from formal discussions, thinking they were too controversial, too heated, and in fact have not done themselves a particular service. So the fact that we're here tonight taking these issues head on is really, I think, a compliment to you. At the most basic level, of course, we have the right to free speech because the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law that inhibits speech. It's a constitutional law, and there is well over 200 years of jurisprudence as to what that means and the very limited circumstances upon which government, and it's critical to note that this is government, can constrain speech. That in general, speech can only be constrained if it poses a direct and immediate threat to a defined group of people. Academic freedom is a construct which has been developed, certainly in the tradition of free speech, to help people in the academy, the professors especially, but also students and everyone else. And it's important to note that academic freedom on a campus applies to everyone, to help them do their jobs on a most basic level. The idea that professors, scholars should be able to, without fear, explore controversial ideas and take them where they have to go is seen as critical, and it has been seen as critical for decades, as part of the academic experience. But because it was a construct, albeit in the tradition of the First Amendment, it also came with responsibilities. In the article that Joel referenced, Inside Higher Education, I go back to the AAUP 1940 statement on tenure that's still, in many ways, the guiding document, which says that, yes, professors have academic freedom, but they should also remember the responsibility that comes with those rights. And I think, just to take it one step further, Joel, one of the phenomena we see right now in the current circumstance is that many of the most heated controversies about free speech and anti-Semitism are happening on private schools, because public universities, including your own, are of course guided by the First Amendment. Private universities, in my view, should be guided by the spirit of the First Amendment, but legally it's a little bit of a gray area. They've had to construct their own ideas of free expression. And over the last decade, in fact, in many campuses, they've moved away from free expression, only to be caught out after October 7th. We can discuss those further.
Yeah, let's just jump right into that. I mean, you talked about the sort of the period over the last decade where we've seen this almost growing chasm between public universities and private institutions. We've seen it very publicly in the fall. We've seen the presidents of Harvard and Penn and MIT testifying before Congress, and then the fallout from that. Let's talk for a minute, let's just jump right into that. At that hearing, where do you think, from your perspective, where were the missteps? And more importantly, on those campuses, what do you think the responsibilities are of administrations and leadership?
It was a fascinating moment because I don't think the presidents of UPenn or Harvard thought on October 8th that they were going to lose their jobs because Hamas invaded Israel, but shows you how the world can work in strange ways. I think what happened was that, first, there were some preparation mistakes. no offense, but they were over-lawyered, for sure. I think many college presidents, including myself, would have said, if asked, is calling for the genocide of Jewish people allowed on your campus, would have begun by saying the human thing, which was, I find all calls for genocide or mass violence against people reprehensible, and I'm ashamed that this often happens on my campus, and I can understand why people are so upset. And I think, as so often the case, people were looking at that moment for the human element. Then you get to the legalisms. I actually think the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT were right in their answer, but they went immediately to the legalism of, it depends on the context, rather than stating first, look, I understand beyond the legalisms that there's a moral and ethical issue here that people are extremely upset about, and I'm sympathetic to you. However, many times people will get upset about what's said on college campuses, and we should not be in the business of regulating speech simply on the basis of the emotional response of others. Where the representatives, the congressional representatives, I think were on solid ground in criticizing those three universities was that, in fact, all three, albeit to different degrees, had very poor records of free speech over the last decade, whether it was canceling lectures, a student atmosphere which was self-censoring, punishing certain faculty and staff for their beliefs, and then suddenly they were free speech warriors when it came to anti-Semitism. And I think that's where they were caught out, because one of the legitimate criticisms was, why doesn't the rules apply to all speech? Now, what I think people took out of that hearing was the wrong answer, which was many people took out of the hearing that anti-Semitic speech should also be censored. I think that's precisely the wrong lesson, not because I'm in favor of anti-Semitic speech, but I believe that what the real lesson was that those schools had gone too far in censoring different aspects of speech and had finally been caught out.
So that's something that may be counterintuitive to some of us, the notion that where free speech and academic freedom too collide with anti-insert here, right? Not just anti-Semitism. And I think this is that piece of your experience as president and CEO of the Newseum and understanding the role of free speech, the role of free press. So, for those of us who are deeply troubled by some of the things that may be said, how do we reconcile that with the reality that we find it truly reprehensible?
I think several things. First, colleges and universities got into the business of making statements, of taking positions in the last few years. And this put them in a not very viable position when it came to, well, why aren't you condemning this, in this case, October 7th, or why aren't you condemning the students? This was a departure from long-standing practice where universities did not take a position on issues for the very reason that the issues were hard, but also they didn't want to tilt the academic landscape in favor of one reason or another, and they didn't want to set the expectation that they should be called upon to make a statement on every issue. So I think that was the first problem. The second issue is that universities got into the practice, in many cases, more often than not in private campuses, but not always, of trying to moderate the speech of faculty and staff and students so that students in particular would not be offended. And I think that got them into a dead end whereby the calls for restrictions on speech became ever greater because people were offended because of a statement about race or ethnicity or scientific accomplishments or known facts. And instead of developing a resilience, an ability to argue, what these schools favored instead was a more censorious atmosphere. So that finally, when it became a very profound issue, where there were deep feelings on many different sides, they just became locked up. I think we have to, I read one day in the newspaper someone saying, well, that group over there, it happened to be a protest in a park, they were engaged in hate speech. That's never covered by the First Amendment. It's actually wrong. Hate speech is, except in very particular circumstances, protected by the First Amendment. And we've gotten to a point, and I think we can explore in a few minutes why we've gotten to this point, which has a lot to do with social media and some other things, where we no longer think that the right response to countering hate speech is more speech, but to tamp down on it, until we've reached a point where it's beginning to conflict with the academic enterprise itself.
I do want to get to how we got here, but I also want to talk about the rise in anti-Semitism in general across the country and on campuses. Jonathan Greenblatt was here last year. Many in the audience were able to attend his talk, and he talked with very clear demonstrable detail from his work at ADL about the rise across the country of incidents of anti-Semitism. What are you seeing on college campuses specifically, and to what do you attribute that, even before October 7th?
Well, it should be said, as you know and as you all know, there are 4,000 college campuses in the United States. And one of the many problems with newspaper coverage right now is you'd think there were about a half a dozen college campuses. All of them, funnily enough, located in the Northeast. You know that's different. The circumstances across campuses vary enormously. Let's just take that as a given. And anyone who says they're speaking about college campuses has to do that with considerable nuance. I would say that in broad strokes, I'm not that surprised that people have been critical of university leaders, because university leaders, I think in many cases, got themselves into a difficult position by taking stances and by censoring speech. That's not surprising. I think there have been criticisms about faculty bias for a long period of time. Oftentimes they're overblown, but that's also an issue, but not a surprising one. What I've found surprising and frankly deeply hurtful is the testimony of individual Jewish students who talk about the personal animosity and insults that they've received from fellow students since October 7th. Yes, there have been protests that bother people, but it's at a very individual level, a very personal level, that many students have come away extremely upset, feeling there's no space for them, feeling that they have been put in a corner from which there's no way out. And frankly, that's been a surprise to me, because I thought that this generation, so sensitive to any type of offensive speech, would be just the opposite. But it's turned out that that's how it's manifested itself the most. Anti-Semitism, just one other remark, in college campuses has a different dynamic than at least anti-Semitism in the United States before October 7th, which was, in broad generalizations, much of the anti-Semitism outside of college campuses before October 7th was driven from what you might call the right. While anti-Semitism, even before October 7th on college campuses, originated from controversies in the Middle East. Since October 7th, of course, that dynamic has changed, and controversies about the Middle East have engulfed many parts of the United States. But the feelings on college campuses, the dynamics were different than October 7th. In some ways, what's happened pre-October 7th on college campuses is now happening across the United States.
It's almost had this galvanizing effect. You talked briefly, alluded to the role of social media and the growth. I suspect, given the more or less age range of this room, you're going to find a sympathetic group of non-heavy social media users. So I do see some undergrads in the room. What are your thoughts, though, about the impact of social media and also how it's impacted post-October 7th?
No, they're very heavy social media, but they're just on Facebook, not on TikTok. I went to the Newseum in part because I thought this was 2015, let's call it peak social media in some ways, peak Facebook, peak Twitter, because I thought this was the greatest explosion of free speech in civilization's history, and that it was an extraordinary moment. Still believe most of that, although I'm less sanguine than before. What we've seen in broad strokes, and it does vary from platform to platform, and I want to talk about TikTok in particular, but the promise of social media was that the people formerly known as the audience could speak and could have their voices heard. And you didn't need to be on network television anymore. You didn't need to look like Walter Cronkite. Anyone could have an audience. What we didn't anticipate was that in addition to allowing people to connect with their friends, find fellow hobbyists who also like growing yellow roses, that this would allow the haters, who've always been there, to organize in a manner that no one anticipated. There had, of course, been racists, anti-Semites, homophobes, and everything else throughout American society. But to some degree, social pressure had tamped down on the most public and obnoxious displays of their hatred and bigotry. Social media allowed them to find themselves. And what we thought was, in the heyday of the optimism about social media, is that the good would wash out all of this. People would be exposed to different views, different ideas, different faiths, different races, and they would learn more. What we didn't anticipate was algorithmically derived audiences. That instead of you being able to survey the whole world and the diversity and beautiful patchwork of American society, the algorithms would drive you more and more to people who thought exactly like you did. And so I think what this produced among young people in particular was a weird dynamic, which was, on the one hand, they were exposed to extraordinarily vicious and ugly words on the internet. On the other hand, the algorithms allowed them to create bubbles, which they lived in. And when they came to college campuses, to some degree, they expected those bubbles to be reinvented, in this case by the adults who ran the campuses. And part of the demand for censorship of offensive speech has been because college campuses, in their most idealized version, don't look like the algorithmically derived silos of social media. They're messier, there's more connection, and people are trying to toggle between what they experience on campus and their phones, and they want the campuses to reinvent those silos. I think in recent times we've come to understand, partially because of manipulation of Facebook algorithms, but more directly because of TikTok, that bad actors can directly manipulate these platforms. TikTok's case, we knew in Facebook's case, we knew the controversy about Russians. With TikTok, it's the Chinese Communist Party and the Iranian regime, in particular, having a lot of impact. I mean, it was noticeable, when protesters were at Nancy Pelosi's house last week, she said, the Russians sent you, and she's hardly, and she sat on the Intelligence Committee for many, many years, so she should have an understanding of these things. So in addition to the algorithms, I think we've come increasingly to understand that bad actors who want to prey upon the divisions of our society can also manipulate them. And the young people, sorry for the young people to say this, who are seen as so sophisticated in the use of social media are not, because they don't understand how these platforms can be manipulated. They don't understand what the algorithms drive people to. Yes, you can be tactile in using your phone and sending up videos, but most young people, for instance, don't even understand when they do a Google search why what they see on the first page appears. They think it's most relevant to them. No, it's because of ads and what's been manipulated through search engine optimization to appear on that first page. So I wish it wasn't so, but I actually think that young people are actually not very sophisticated when it comes to devices that now play a central part of their lives. And that's part of the problem. It's also, I think, part of our responsibility that At Colgate, I was very pleased at orientation. We began a couple of sessions on digital etiquette. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to do online? We didn't tell them what to do, but we asked them the question, what are you trying to do? And oh, by the way, whatever you're trying to do, it will last forever. This was a surprise to many students.
The digital footprint that lasts for eternity. So let's take this thread a little bit further. What is our responsibility as a university when high school students arrive here on campus to show them the space that they're now in, to show them that they're not in their TikTok world, or that they're not in the small enclave? What is our responsibility to show them that, and what is our responsibility at the same time, or if we have one, to protect them from what they might find?
Other than military bases, the American college campus remains the most diverse space in the United States. Given the segregation in our society, for all the flaws that college campuses have, they're still better at bringing people of difference together than every place else except the military. And I think you have to say at the beginning to students, you came to campus, you came to this physical place when you could have done an online degree, could have stayed at home, could have done it all.
Some still want to stay at home, for the record, in their PJs.
Yeah, you could have stayed at home. You chose instead to come to a place to physically interact with the place and other people. Why not take advantage of that? You've left home, you've left your parents have paid a considerable amount of money for this privilege. If you don't interact with the people who are close to you by physical proximity, then you're losing the very opportunity, the very reason you came to campus in the first place. That's not to say don't give up your phone or don't go on the internet. Of course they're going to do that. But you have to say, you came here. You came to this place because it was a place with other human beings, and you were going to have a social relationship with them. And I think we don't say that to our students enough. It killed me at Colgate when I would go into the library and I would see a bunch of students around a table and they were all looking at their phones. There's plenty of time for that. And I recognize as an adult that there are limits to how much we can police. Maybe the worst received administrative idea I ever had was when I was provost of Miami University. And I suggested turning off the Wi-Fi in the dorms from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. each morning. This was before students could get the internet on their phones. Because I said, your mother used to say that nothing good happened after midnight. Certainly no one should be on their phones after 2 a.m. And I said, except for exam time, we'll let them be. Well, you would have thought the world had ended, and I lost that one. But I didn't give up at least saying, you came here for a reason. And I think we have to educate them about what these unbelievably powerful devices do, how they work, how they're manipulated, sometimes by the companies, sometimes by bad actors, sometimes in ways that we don't even understand. We do a very poor job of educating them because we think young people have an intuitive knowledge of these things. They don't. They're in fact incredibly naive, finally. And then I think we have to teach them about the robust tradition of the First Amendment, that speech was guaranteed, that the government was not going to intervene because we thought it was a fundamental right, and the way to combat that of speech that's offensive is not to shut it off, not to turn it off, not to turn away from it, but to understand it and then figure out ways of combating it.
As we're continuing the conversation, I want to remind everyone that there are cards in front of you. If you have questions you'd like to ask, please write them. Our student ambassadors will collect them and share them with me to ask Jeff as the conversation continues. Jeff, that's something that we confront a lot on campus and that I've been thinking a lot about actually just in the last week, which is what happens, what is our responsibility as an institution? Two different scenarios where we have a speaker who's been invited to campus who we know is going to engage in speech that will be troubling to members of our community, whether it has to do with the conflict in in Israel and Gaza, or anything else for that matter. And the second category, this is the one that I find in some ways a little bit trickier, is someone who's going to come talk about something that has nothing to do with any of that, but who's posted on social media, let's say, about the conflict or about other things that we find deeply troubling. What's our responsibility as an institution, and how do we, if we invite speakers who have views that are going to be troubling to members of our community, how do we engage in that conversation openly while also allowing the members of our community to feel safe?
Right, so I confront this often as a college administrator. Among the most poignant moments was soon after George Floyd was murdered. I had, as part of our public speaker series, a Los Angeles Police Department lieutenant talking about public safety, who happened to be the head of the San Fernando Valley police unit. San Fernando Valley, part of Los Angeles, if it was its own city, would be the 7th or 8th largest city in America. So this was a very senior LAPD officer. Many people who said they were offended by this, it was too soon, I should have someone on the other side, whatever side that was, and I went forward. And I think the first position is you never cancel unless you believe that there is a direct violent threat to a defined group of people. That canceling is the worst possible thing because it sets a series of precedents which other people will inevitably reference when they want some other speaker down the line who they believe is offensive for other good reasons to not speak on campus. So I think you never cancel. But you also have to set up an institutional culture which says that the people we invite in do not reflect an institutional position. They simply reflect a belief that some unit has, someone has, that these people have something to say which should be heard. Because too many people, and I think students make this error in particular, believe that the invitation of a speaker signifies institutional acceptance and institutional bias. It shouldn't at all. It should reflect mainly only that the speaker, the program has something to contribute. If you have that institutional culture, then I think it's much easier to say, this may be offensive to you, in which case, but it does not reflect the standing of the university or the beliefs of the university. It reflects simply that this person has something to say. As you know, in the article on Inside Higher Education, I, as president of American Jewish University, said that UPenn should continue to host the Palestine Rights Conference, because I thought there was no evidence whatsoever of an imminent violent threat to anyone on that campus, and some units of UPenn thought that this were valuable contributions. It therefore met, to me, every academic criteria possible. Where UPenn failed was when there was controversy, they backed down a little bit and they said, oh, it's a couple of departments sponsoring it. It's not the university. I mean, that's just completely bogus. If you have 4 departments in a program sponsoring something, it's the university sponsoring it. And you might as well just own it and say, look, we think this is important for people to hear.
That's one of the things that we find more and more is the universities, we don't sponsor anything, right? That unit did it, or that individual brought this person here, as opposed to accepting this part of a broader community. We've talked about students. We've talked a little bit now about outsiders. What about our faculty and staff? Our faculty and staff in a variety of ways have felt unsafe in recent months. I shared with you at dinner last night a note that was placed under the door of a member of the College of Arts and Sciences faculty in recent weeks. What's the institution's responsibility in that space when there is not maybe a direct violent threat, but there are clearly imputed threats inherent in speech in some form or another?
Well, I think the university has not only a role in telling faculty that they should be the agents of promoting speech, but also that it should be an environment where people, of course, feel safe. That's not by censoring others, but by reaching out. And I think many college presidents have done this after October 7th, whether it's appearing at Hillel's or going to events, or simply writing notes to faculty who feel worried and saying, we want you to be a central part of this institution, even if you're not happy with some of the things going on. And you have to understand that the institution is not taking a stance on the Middle East conflict or anything else, but we want you to feel secure. I think there is a path there. I don't think it's that narrow a path, but where universities got themselves into trouble, where the private schools in particular are going to have to stand back, is they thought, to be honest, there was a lot of cost-free virtue signaling about a lot of positions that a lot of schools took, and they thought that it was an easy way of showing they were on the right side until suddenly, after October 7th, they got thrust into a complicated set of positions, and they wanted out. And they're going to have to rethink how they proceed in the future.
How are they going to get out of that? I mean, they are in a box, right? I mean, so what's the pathway?
Well, I think you just have to say, I think the Stanford letter, which I think was good, which said, we took positions in the past and that was probably a mistake. They didn't quite say it that deliberately, but they said, we took positions in the past, we acknowledge that, we're not going to do it so much in the future. One of the great things about college is that, except for the faculty, the students reinvent every couple of years, and you can change the culture. And I think you have to say, look, we all learn, institutions evolve. In the future, we're not going to make some of the mistakes that we made in the past because we understand better what the consequences of those decisions were.
I'm going to ask, do you have questions for me somewhere? I'm going to ask to get the questions, if I could.
Yes.
Sorry.
The first thought.
Okay, I see a lot of them. We're not going to get through everything, I know, but we'll try to get through as many as we can. Want to make sure we get, just not the Joel Samuels perspective on the Jeff Herbst thoughts, but let me start with this one. What are the two most significant items, actions that you would recommend to colleges and universities to take to address the anti-Semitism and to bring civility and appropriate behavior that reconciles free inquiry with dangerous speech?
I think schools should model to students how to discuss difficult questions by having more programming on the Middle East, more programming on Israel, Gaza, Palestine, more programming on the dynamics of anti-Semitism and how students are feeling. And they should demonstrate to students by having people with, in some cases, radically different beliefs appear on stage together and show that they can talk, not because they're going to reach agreement, because they're not in many cases, but they can talk and debate and move the intellectual train of thought forward. And that's the most important thing, because students these days have very few models of how to have constructive conversations with each other. Social media has put them in camps where only the beliefs are only what they want to hear. They can listen to television that has beliefs that they only want to hear. They go to blogs that they know what's going to be said. If colleges and universities can model constructive, fierce debate among people at the end of the day who recognize each other as scholars and as humans, I think that's the greatest contribution.
It's funny, I'm smiling because one of the initiatives in the past few years that I've been involved in and trying to fundraise for is around creating a civility institute at USC. And part of what we've talked about doing, if we're able to pull this off, is not only doing, and we've talked about partnering with ETV, South Carolina TV, our local public television across the state, to have debates. We actually have it lined up an initial conversation between Tim Scott and Jim Clyburn, where they would pick a topic on which they disagree vehemently, but model that civil debate. And the idea that we actually have is to take the debates across the state to each of the counties, hold the events in a high school in the community, where we can, again, model the ability to disagree, and they don't all have to be nationally prominent political figures, right? It's about having the ability to recognize disagreement and to be able to do it in a way where you can have a civil discourse and fundamentally disagree, right, at the core, but still nonetheless, and then, again, to show this for our students across the state, but then for citizens, using the benefits of public television.
The greatest example of this that I ever saw was actually not on a college campus. Some of you may remember the vice presidential debate between Dick Cheney and Joe Lieberman, which were two people who disagreed fundamentally. They also happened to be, this is an era that is almost past in American politics, friends. And they went at each other in very constructive ways, pointed out the disagreements, but there was an underlying recognition of each other as people. And I remember at the end the commentators saying they could not believe what they had just witnessed. That's a debate worth replaying every once in a while.
Shifting gears back to talking about students a little bit, to what extent is the focus on student comfort simply a function of the trend of treating students as customers, especially if those students have parents who have contributed significant sums in donations to institutions?
I think that there's some of that, for sure. And as real tuition has increased because state legislatures have decreased funding and universities are forced ever more to look at the necessity of maximizing revenue by bringing in as many students as possible and retaining those students, there can be a thought that, well, we'll make it as comfortable and we'll make it as easy for students as possible. And also, it should be said that colleges and universities have embarked on the difficult and imperfect task of welcoming many communities that have often felt estranged from academic institutions. That work is important, it's ongoing. I happen to think, in this case, we've grossly underestimated the students. That what would really appeal to them was a more vibrant academic and intellectual atmosphere. That the studies show they're self-censoring because they're afraid. They don't know what to say, so they don't say much of anything that's controversial. I think that schools could reach out, become more prominent if they said, we're actually going to treat you like adults, which is you can say a lot of things, and you may hear a lot of things which you disagree with, but we're going to do it in an atmosphere where we recognize each other as a community. I think that's the path forward, but it's not a path yet that a lot of schools have taken.
No, and it requires a lot of infrastructure to have built. The community has to be present for that to be successful. And that actually, I think, leads naturally into this next question, not planned, but this is a multi-level question, as a dean of libraries might ask. As a practical matter, I'm not supposed to say that, right? As a practical matter, how can the university play the role of helping students understand free speech, responsible social media use, and respect for diversity, if by the time they get here, they haven't learned those things from parents, peers, teachers in the 12 preceding years? How can universities remedy that in just a few short years? What's a reasonable expectation?
Of course, it's a good question. And I'd say that, look, I'm delighted that as a parent, my kids got through their teenage years before smartphones really took off. Because I think the job parents have today with hate speech, with ubiquitous pornography, with everything else that is available with only a couple of clicks makes parenting extraordinarily difficult. I think parents don't have a clue as to what to do and have more or less, in many cases, either thrown up their hands or somehow had the misguided belief that the elementary and high schools were going to teach students this. Of course, people come to college at 18 years old with a lot of ingrained habits, but they also come to college looking for a new start. Some students change their name when they get to schools. Some change the nature of their friend group. Some change the activities that they belong in because they recognize, and we should tell them, this is one of the few moments in your life where you can reinvent yourself. So why not reinvent also the way you consume information in media? I like to ask students, at the Newseum and now, what's your news consumption strategy? Not tell them what it should be, but just ask them if they have one. And of course, most of them don't. And then therefore they're thrust into whatever silo the algorithms push them in. And as soon as you say, well, what do you think your strategy for consumption of news or consumption of media or consumption of music should be, it should get them thinking that they should have a strategy. And I don't think it's my business to tell them what their strategy should be. Well, they'll have some ideas. But I think if we ask them, how are you approaching this technology? I also think we have to give ourselves a break. In a few short years, these devices have become an extraordinarily important part of our lives with no precedent in human history. And it's only natural that etiquette and practice will march much more slowly than technology. But we have to start.
We're joined by many members of our community, and I don't usually single any out, but I'm pleased that both Beth Bernstein and Micah Caskey from our legislature have taken time to join us to be part of this conversation. And Beth has asked a couple of questions I'd like to share with you. The first is, what can be done about holding social media platforms accountable for lack of journalistic integrity, as it were, of the information they're disseminating? So that's one. And then an unrelated but also important question is, while hate speech in and of itself is protected, that isn't the case, obviously, when it can incite violence that is not protected. So what can college campuses do to make sure they're protecting the First Amendment, but to prevent that kind of speech, particularly as it relates to Jewish students and members of our community?
Well, I think on the second one, as I said, there is a well-defined body of law as to, there are always some gray areas, but it's pretty well defined as to when speech becomes an actual threat. And I think talking about that will be an education onto itself for students. And I think it just has to be analyzed as to, okay, what's happening? What is the speaker actually doing? I'm actually unhappy that many Jewish groups have worked, especially over the last few months, to shut down many Palestinian speakers on a variety of campuses who, in my view, pose no threat whatsoever to Jewish students or the Jewish community. They were going to say things which the Jewish students disagreed with. That's life. And I think, most of all, it was a disservice to Jewish students not to at least have the opportunity to hear those voices, because those voices are out there, whether college campuses shut them down or not. And sooner or later, students are going to leave those college campuses and confront those voices unregulated. And now, speaking only about this community, which I know well, Jewish students are poorly equipped to handle anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic arguments because in many cases they've been protected from that speech rather than taught how to engage it in a manner that's most constructive. And I think that's extremely unfortunate. Most of all, it's a disservice to the Jewish students. You're not protecting them because it's a bad world out there. They'd better learn how to deal with it. And I would say that with other groups also. What was the first question?
Well, before I get back to the first question, let me follow up on that. So what are you doing on your campus to better prepare your students?
We have a rabbinic school, as some of you know, trains seminary, essentially, for rabbis, where we try to expose them to a variety of arguments about what is happening in Israel. And I try to talk to students and faculty about how to engage in anti-Semitic speech. And the first thing I say to them is, just because you hear something that you don't like doesn't make it anti-Semitic. It may be wrong, but one of the problems with labeling so much speech these days anti-Semitic is it tends to take all the oxygen out of the room immediately because people get very defensive, they hunker down. And let's take, for instance, the BDS movement. I can argue that it's wrong to boycott, divest, or sanction Israel for all kinds of reasons without even approaching that the advocates are anti-Semitic. I think in many cases those are more powerful arguments. I don't want to ignore that there may be an anti-Semitic impetus in them, but going to the anti-Semitic cudgel immediately cuts out the argument that, no, you're just wrong. You have the facts wrong, rather than immediately impugning whatever someone's advocating. So I think that's how to, if you really want to protect, and you really want to, we're talking about Jewish students, but I'd say it was true of other students, if you really want to protect these students, teach them how to deal with speech that they may not like, because sooner or later they're going to deal with it anyhow.
Saskia's given me the 5 minutes. Actually, she gave me the 5 minutes ago. But I'm going to take a few more questions. And I do want to, the other part of the question was, what can be done about holding social media platforms accountable for their role?
Well, I mean, I must say I've wavered in this, and I used to think that the social media platform should not be regulated. But, I've seen the congressional hearings too, and we've have now 20 years of arguments about Facebook in particular, and some of the research on how the platforms manipulate, in particular, teenagers in terms of their consumption of media and beliefs is pretty powerful. I would favor, you got to be careful what you ask for here. In my more optimistic days, I would have just said more speech on social media platforms. I don't think that's quite good enough anymore. And I think we have to explore carefully tailored means of curtailing some of what's on the social media platforms without impugning the First Amendment, which is still governing this, and be very careful of unintended consequences. Because there's a whole plaintiff's bar out here, which as soon as you put any restrictions on social media, we'll see this is a big new opportunity for all kinds of verdicts and everything else. And there'll always be another platform. And if people don't feel that they can express themselves on social media platforms out of Cupertino or Menlo Park, they'll express themselves as social media platforms out of Moscow and Beijing. I mean, that's just the reality.
This takes the conversation a little bit further beyond what we've talked about. Much of what has been discussed here tonight and elsewhere has started from the premise that there is and should be a constitutional protection of free speech. Considering that there is a natural evolution of cultures and governments over time, at what point, if any, do you think there should be a reconsideration of the extent of these legal protections in light of societal change?
I think the First Amendment, for all its challenges, and of course it goes well beyond speech to religion, assembly, petition, has been one of the great gifts to our society. As I said before, I think we have to realize the moment we're in, which is technology had its advance at a speed, whether you call it Moore's Law or whatever else, which has far outstripped our society's ability to adapt. And we also have to kind of give ourselves some time. We have to do it deliberately and have to pay much more attention to it than we're doing now. But we have to give ourselves time to adapt to where technology is going rather than trying to shut it down. And as I said, I mean, in the world we live in today, you're not going to shut down social media platforms. You're not going to shut down offensive speech. You may migrate it elsewhere, to Tehran or Beijing or Moscow or someplace like that. So I think we should take advantage of the First Amendment. More speech is always better, but we have to recognize the world we're in. And of course, the technology keeps moving. We haven't even begun to understand yet what artificial intelligence, the ability to manipulate images in real time and the like, how that's going to change our conversation, but it's out there.
You know, you may not know this because it hasn't got a lot of national attention, but ours is the first state to have this legislature decide to set a standing committee focused on artificial intelligence, and it's in the I guess next year it'll officially stand. But Jeff Bradley from down on the coast is leading that committee, and I have to say that committee has already been engaging with our university faculty from our college and the College of Engineering have already testified before that committee in its first month. And so they're engaging those questions, including the roles of universities in preparing not only students but citizens across the state for a world where AI is driving so much of what's happening. It's clear to me that bringing you here to campus every 5 or 6 years is not the way to go. Maybe every 5 to 6 months, because I see Megan standing over there with yet another stack of cards that we're not going to be able to get to. And I just, Jeff, want to just take a minute to say thank you. When this event was first announced, several faculty members around the university sent me emails and say, it's a really bold decision and risky move to host this event. And I thought, to the contrary, I appreciated the message, but I thought to the contrary, this is the essential conversation that we need to be having. And these are the essential conversations that we, as a university, as the university, not only of South Carolina, but for South Carolina, need to be having on a regular basis. But to have you here to lead that conversation with your wealth of experience was quite extraordinary. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. I'll just say one final thing, especially to faculty, which is faculty, of course, often get a bad rap. It's often fun to make professors. The debates we're having now about how to transmit knowledge, how knowledge can be understood, how debates can be made more constructive, this validates all the reasons why we went into this career. And I think people are looking to us for societal answers in a profound and searching way that's difficult, challenging, but also, I think, at the end of the day, extremely rewarding. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here.